PALELY Loitering by Christopher Priest. This 1979 winner of the British Science Fiction Award, which also took third place for the 1980 Locus Award and sixth place for the 1980 Hugo Award, was first published in the January 1979 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Its first inclusion in a collection of the author's stories was in An Infinite Summer in the same year. It was selected for editor Terry Carr's 1980 anthology, The Best Science Fiction Novellas of the Year, number 2, in 1980. By 1982, it had been translated and reprinted in French, German, Dutch, Swedish, and Japanese magazines, with the aforementioned books getting the same treatment. Spanish and Italian magazine inclusions came in 1992, and from 2013 onward, it's been included in multiple international collections. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. PALELY Loitering. 1. During the summers of my childhood, the best treat of all was our annual picnic at Flux Channel Park, which lay some 50 miles from home. Because my father was set in his ways, and for him no picnic would be worthy of its name without a joint of freshly roasted cold ham. The first clue we children had was always, therefore, when cook began her preparations. I made a point every day of slipping down unnoticed to the cellar to count the hams that hung from steel hooks in the ceiling, and as soon as I found one was missing, I would hurry to my sisters and share the news. The next day, the house would fill with the rich aroma of ham roasting and cloves, and we three children would enter an elaborate charade. Inside, we would be brimming over with excitement at the thought of the adventure, but at the same time restraining ourselves to act normally, because Father's announcement of his plans at breakfast on the chosen day was an important part of the fun. We grew up in awe and dread of our father, for he was a distant and strict man. Throughout the winter months, when his work made its greatest demands, we hardly saw him, and all we knew of him were the instructions passed on to us by Mother or the governor. In the summer months, he chose to maintain the distance, joining us only for meals and spending the evenings alone in his study. However, once a year my father would mellow, and for this alone the excursions to the park would have been cause for joy. He knew the excitement the trip held for us, and he played up to it, revealing the instinct of showman and actor. Sometimes he would start by pretending to scold or punish us for some imaginary misdemeanor, or would ask Mother a misleading question, such as whether it was that day the servants were taking a holiday, or he would affect absent-mindedness. Through all this, we would hug our knees under the table, knowing what was to come. Then at last he would utter the magic words, "Flux Channel Park." And, abandoning our charade with glee, we children would squeal with delight and run to Mother. The servants would bustle in and clear away the breakfast. There would be a clatter of dishes and the creak of the wicker hamper from the kitchen, and at long last the crunching of hooves and steel-rimmed wheels would sound on the gravel drive outside as the taxi carriage arrived to take us to the station. 2. I believe that my parents went to the park from the year they were married, but my own first clear memory of a picnic is when I was 7 years old. We went as a family every year until I was 15. For 9 summers that I can remember, then, the picnic was the happiest day of the year, fusing in memory into one composite day, each picnic much like all the others. So carefully did Father orchestrate the treat for us. And yet, one day stands out from all the others because of a moment of disobedience and mischief, and after that those summery days in Flux Channel Park were never quite the same again. It happened when I was 10 years old. The day had started like any other picnic day, and by the time the taxi arrived, the servants had gone on ahead to reserve a train compartment for us. As we clambered into the carriage, Cook ran out of the house to wave us away, and she gave each of us children a freshly peeled carrot to gnaw on. I took mine whole into my mouth, distending my cheeks and sucking and nibbling at it slowly, mashing it gradually into a juicy pulp. As we rattled down to the station, I saw Father glancing at me once or twice, as if to tell me not to make so much noise with my mouth, but it was a holiday from everything, and he said nothing. My mother, sitting opposite us in the carriage, issued her usual instructions to my sisters. "Saline," my elder sister, "you're to keep an eye on Michael. You know how he runs around." I, sucking my carrot, made a face at Saline, bulging a cheek with the carrot and squinting my eyes. "And you, Therese, you must stay by me. None of you is to go too close to the channel." Her instructions came too soon. The train ride was of second-order interest, but it came between us and the park. I enjoyed the train, smelling the sooty smoke and watching the steam curl past the compartment window like an attended white wraith. But my sisters, especially Celine, were unaccustomed to the motion and felt sick. While Mother fussed over the girls and summoned the servants from their compartment further down the train, Father and I sat gravely beside each other. When Celine had been taken away down the train and Therese had quietened, I started to fidget in my seat, craning my neck to peer forward, seeking that first magical glimpse of the silvery ribbon of the channel. "Father, which bridge shall we cross this time? And can we cross 2 bridges today like last year?" Always the same answer. "We shall decide when we arrive. Keep still, Michael." And so we arrived, tugging at our parents' hands to hurry them, waiting anxiously by the gate as the entrance fees were paid. The first dashing run down the sloping green sward of the park grounds, dodging the trees and jumping high to see along the channel, shouting disappointment because there were too many people there already, or not enough. Father beamed at us and lit his pipe, flicking back the flaps of his frock coat and thrusting his thumbs into his waistcoat, then strolled beside Mother as she held his arm. My sisters and I walked, or ran, depending on our constitutional state, heading towards the channel, but slowing when awed by its closeness, not daring to approach. Looking back, we saw Father and Mother waving to us from the shade of the trees, needlessly warning us of the dangers. As always, we hurried to the toll booths for the time bridges that crossed the channel, for it was these bridges that were the whole reason for the day's trip. A line of people was waiting at each booth, moving forward slowly to pay the entrance fee. Families like ourselves with children dancing, young couples holding hands, single men and women glancing speculatively at each other. We counted the people in each queue, eagerly checked the results with each other, then ran back to our parents. "Father, there are only 26 people at the tomorrow bridge." "There's no one at the yesterday bridge," Saline, exaggerating as usual. "Can we cross into tomorrow, Mother?" "We did that last year." Saline, still disgruntled from the train, kicked out feebly at me. "Michael always wants to go to tomorrow." "No, I don't. The queue is longer for yesterday." Mother, soothingly, "We'll decide after lunch. The queues will be shorter then." Father, watching the servants laying our cloth beneath a dark old cedar tree, said, "Let us walk for a while, my dear. The children can come too. We will have luncheon in an hour or so." Our second exploration of the park was more orderly conducted, as it was under Father's eye. We walked again to the nearest part of the channel. It seemed less risky now, with parents there, and followed one of the paths that ran parallel to the bank. We stared at the people on the other side. "Father, are they in yesterday or tomorrow?" "I can't say, Michael. It could be either." "They're nearer to the yesterday bridge, stupid." Saline, pushing me from behind. "That doesn't mean anything, stupid," jabbing back at her with an elbow. The sun, reflecting from the silvery surface of the flux fluid, we sometimes called it water to my father's despair, made it glitter and sparkle like rippling quicksilver. Mother would not look at it, saying the reflections hurt her eyes, but there was always something dreadful about its presence, so that no one could look too long. In the still patches, where the mystifying currents below briefly let the surface settle, we sometimes saw upside-down reflections of the people on the other side. Later, we edged around the tolls, where the lines of people were longer than before, and walked further along the bank towards the east. Then, later, we returned to the shade and the trees and sat in a demure group while lunch was served. My father carved ham with the precision of the expert chef, one cut down at an angle towards the bone, another horizontally across to the bone, and the wedge of meat so produced taken away on a plate by one of the servants. Then the slow, meticulous carving beneath the notch, one slice after another, each one slightly wider and rounder than the one before. As soon as lunch was finished, we made our way to the toll booths and queued with the other people. There were always fewer people waiting at this time of the afternoon, a fact that surprised us, but which our parents took for granted. This day we had chosen the Tomorrow Bridge. Whatever the preferences we children expressed, Father always had the last word. It did not, however, prevent Saline from sulking, nor me from letting her see the joys of victory. This particular day was the first time I had been to the park with any understanding of the flux channel and its real purpose. Earlier in the summer, the governor had instructed us in the rudiments of spatio-temporal physics, although that was not the name he gave to it. My sisters had been bored with the subject. It was boys' stuff, they declared, but to learn how and why the channel had been built was fascinating to me. I had grown up with a general understanding that we lived in a world where our ancestors had built many marvelous things that we no longer used or had need for. This awareness, gleaned from the few other children I knew, was of astonishing and miraculous achievements, and was, as might be expected, wildly inaccurate. I knew as a fact, for instance, that the flux channel had been built in a matter of days, that jet-propelled aircraft could circumnavigate the world in a matter of minutes, and that houses and automobiles and railway trains could be built in a matter of seconds. Of course, the truth was quite different, and our education in the scientific age and its history was constantly interesting to me. In the case of the flux channel, I knew by my 10th birthday that it had taken more than 2 decades to build, that its construction had cost many human lives, and that it had taxed the resources and intelligence of many different countries. Furthermore, the principle on which it worked was well understood today, even though we had no use for it as it was intended. We lived in the age of starflight, but by the time I was born, mankind had long lost the desire to travel in space. The governor had shown us a slowed-down film of the launching of the craft that had flown to the stars, the surface of the flux channel undulating as the starship was propelled through its deeps like a huge whale trying to navigate a canal, then the hump of its hull bursting through the surface in a shimmering spray of exploding foam, and the gushing wake sluicing over the banks of the channel and vanishing instantaneously. Then the actual launch, with the starship soaring into the sky, leaving a trail of brilliant droplets in the air behind it. All this had taken place in under 1/10 of a second. Anyone within 25 miles of the launch would have been killed by the shock wave, and it is said that the thunder of the starship's passage could be heard in every country of the European Union. Only the automatic high-speed cameras were there to witness the launching. The men and women who crewed the ship, their metabolic functions frozen for most of the flight, would not have felt the strain of such a tremendous acceleration even if they had been conscious. The flux field distorted time and space, changed the nature of matter. The ship was launched at such a high relative velocity that by the time the technicians had returned to the flux channel, it would have been outside the solar system. By the time I was born, 70 years after this, the starship would have been, well, who knows where. Behind it, churning and eddying with temporal mystery, the flux channel lay across more than 100 miles of the land, a scintillating, dazzling ribbon of light, like a slit in the world that looks towards another dimension. There were no more starships after the first, and that one had never returned. When the disturbance of the launching had calmed to a degree where the flux field was no longer a threat to human safety, the stations that tapped the electricity had been built along part of its banks. A few years later, when the flux field had stabilized completely, an area of the countryside was landscaped to create the park and the time bridges were built. One of these traversed the channel at an angle of exactly 90 degrees, and to walk across it was no different from crossing any bridge across any ordinary river. One bridge was built slightly obtuse of the right angle, and to cross it was to climb the temporal gradient of the flux field. When one emerged on the other side of the channel, 24 hours had elapsed. The third bridge was built slightly acute of the right angle, and to cross to the other side was to walk 24 hours into the past. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow existed on the far side of the flux channel, and one could walk at will among them. 3. While waiting in line at the toll booth, we had another argument about Father's decision to cross into tomorrow. The park management had posted a board above the pay desk describing the weather conditions on the other side. There was wind, low cloud, sudden showers. My mother said that she did not wish to get wet. Saline, watching me, quietly repeated that we had been to tomorrow last year. I stayed quiet, looking across the channel to the other side. Over there, the weather seemed to be as it was here, a high, bright sky, hot sunshine. But what I could see was today. Yesterday's tomorrow. Tomorrow's yesterday. Today's today. Behind us, the queue was thinning as other, less hardy people drifted away to the other bridges. I was content because the only one that did not interest me was the Today Bridge. But to rub in my accidental victory, I whispered to Saline that the weather was good on the yesterday side. She, in no mood for subtle perversity, kicked out at my shins, and we squabbled stupidly as my father went to the toll. He was an important man. I heard the attendant say, "But you shouldn't have waited, sir. We are honored by your visit." He released the ratchet of the turnstile, and we filed through. We entered the covered way of the bridge, a long, dark tunnel of wood and metal, lit at intervals by dim, incandescent lamps. I ran on ahead, feeling the familiar electric tingle over my body as I moved through the flux field. "Michael, stay with us!" my father calling from behind. I slowed obediently and turned to wait. I saw the rest of the family coming towards me, and the outlines of their bodies were strangely diffused, an effect of the field on all who entered it. As they reached me and thus came into the zone I was in, their shapes became sharply focused once more. I let them pass me and followed behind. Saline, walking beside me, kicked out at my ankles. "Why did you do that?" "Because you're a little pig." I ignored her. We could see the end of the covered way ahead. It had become dark soon after we started crossing the bridge, a presage of the evening of the day we were leaving. But now daylight shone again, and I saw pale blue morning light, misty shapes of trees. I paused, seeing my parents and sisters silhouetted against the light. Therese, holding Mother's hand, took no notice of me, but Celine, whom I secretly loved, strutting proudly behind Father, asserting her independence of me. Perhaps it was because of her, or perhaps it was that morning light shining down from the end of the tunnel, but I stayed still as the rest of the family went on. I waved my hands, watching the fingertips blur as they moved across the flux field, and then I walked on slowly. Because of the blurring, my family were now almost invisible. Suddenly I was a little frightened, alone in the flux field, and I hastened after them. I saw their ghostly shapes move into daylight and out of sight. Celine glanced back towards me, and I walked faster. By the time I had reached the end of the covered way, the day had matured, and the light was that of mid-afternoon. Low clouds were scudding before a stiff wind. As a squall of rain swept by, I sheltered in the bridge and looked across the park for the family. I saw them a short distance away, hurrying towards one of the pagoda-shaped shelters the park authorities had built. Glancing at the sky, I saw there was a large patch of blue not far away, and I knew the shower would be a short one. It was not cold, and I did not mind getting wet, but I hesitated before going out into the open. Why I stood there, I do not now recall, but I had always had a childish delight in the sensation of the flux field, and at the place where the covered way ends, the bridge is still over a part of the channel. I stood by the edge of the bridge and looked down at the flux fluid. Seen from directly above, it closely resembled water because it seemed to be clear, although the bottom could not be seen, and did not have the same metallic sheen or quicksilver property that it had when viewed from the side. There were bright highlights on the surface, glinting as the fluid stirred, as if there were a film of oil across it. My parents had reached the pagoda, whose colorful tiles and paintwork looked odd in this dismal rain, and they were squeezing in with the two girls as other people made room for them. I could see my father's tall black hat bobbing behind the crowd. Celine was looking back at me, perhaps envying my solitary state, and so I stuck out my tongue at her. I was showing off. I went to the edge of the bridge, where there was no guardrail, and leaned precariously out above the fluid. The flux field prickled around me. I saw Celine tugging at my mother's arm, and Father took a step forward into the rain. I poised myself and jumped towards the bank, flying above the few inches of the channel between me and the ground. I heard a roaring in my ears. I was momentarily blinded, and the charge of the flux field enveloped me like an electric cocoon. I landed feet first on the muddy bank and looked around me as if nothing untoward had happened. 4. Although I did not realize it at first, in leaping from the bridge and moving up through a part of the flux field, I had traveled in time. It happened that I landed on a day in the future when the weather was as gray and blustery as on the day I had left, and so my first real awareness, when I looked up, was that the pagoda had suddenly emptied. I stared in horror across the parkland, not believing that my family could have vanished in the blink of an eye. I started to run, stumbling and sliding on the slippery ground, and I felt a panicky terror and a dread of being abandoned. All the cockiness in me had gone. I sobbed as I ran, and when I reached the pagoda, I was crying aloud, sniveling and wiping my nose and eyes on the sleeve of my jacket. I went back to where I had landed and saw the muddy impressions of my feet on the bank. From there I looked at the bridge, so tantalizingly close, and it was then that I realized what I had done, even though it was a dim understanding. Something like my former mood returned then, and a spirit of exploration came over me. After all, it was the first time I had ever been alone in the park. I started to walk away from the bridge, following a tree-lined path that went along the channel. The day I had arrived, it must have been a weekday in winter or early spring, because the trees were bare and there were very few people about. From this side of the channel I could see that the toll booths were open, but the only other people in the park were a long way away. For all this, it was still an adventure, and the awful thoughts about where I had arrived, or how I was to return, were put aside. I walked a long way, enjoying the freedom of being able to explore this side without my family. When they were present, it was as if I could only see what they pointed out and walk where they chose. Now it was like being in the park for the first time. This pleasure, small and unpositive, soon palled. It was a cold day, and my light summer shoes began to feel sodden and heavy, chafing against my toes. The park was not at all how I liked it to be. Part of the fun on a normal day was the atmosphere of shared daring and mixing with people whom you knew did not at all come from the same day. Once, my father, in a mood of exceptional capriciousness, had led us to and fro across the today and yesterday bridges, showing us time-slipped images of himself which he had made on a visit to the park the day before. Visitors to the park often did such things, and during the holidays, when the big factories were closed, the park would be full of shouting, laughing voices as carefully prepared practical jokes of this sort were played. None of this was going on as I tramped along under the leaden sky. The future was, for me, as commonplace as a field. I began to worry, wondering how I was to get back. I could imagine the wrath of my father, the tears of my mother, the endless jibes I would get from Céline and Therese. I turned around and walked quickly back towards the bridges, forming a half-hearted plan to cross the channel repeatedly, using the tomorrow and yesterday bridges in turn, until I was back where I started. I was running again, in danger of sobbing, when I saw a young man walking along the bank towards me. I would have paid no attention to him but for the fact that, when we were a short distance apart, he sidestepped so that he was in front of me. I slowed, regarding him incuriously, and went to walk around him, but much to my surprise, he called after me, "Michael! It is Michael, isn't it? How do you know my name?" I said, pausing and looking at him warily. "I was looking for you. You've jumped forward in time and don't know how to get back." "Well, yes, but I'll show you how. It's easy." We were facing each other now, and I was wondering who he was and how he knew me. There was something much too friendly about him. He was very tall and thin, and had the beginnings of a mustache darkening his lip. He seemed adult to me, but when he spoke, it was with a hoarse, boyish falsetto. I said, "It's all right, thank you, sir. I can find my own way." "By running across the bridges? How did you know?" "You'll never manage it, Michael. When you jumped from the bridge, you went a long way into the future, about 32 years. This is..." I looked around at the park, disbelieving what he said. "But it feels like... just like tomorrow. But it isn't. You've come a long way. Look over there." He pointed across the channel to the other side. "Do you see those houses? You've never seen those before, have you?" There was an estate of new houses built beyond the trees on the park's perimeter. True, I hadn't noticed them before, but it proved nothing. I didn't find this very interesting, and I began to sidle away from him, wanting to get on with the business of working out how to get back. "Thank you, sir. It was nice to meet you." "Don't call me sir," he said, laughing. "You've been taught to be polite to strangers, but you must know who I am." No." Suddenly, rather nervous of him, I walked quickly away, but he ran over and caught me by the arm. "There's something I must show you," he said. "This is very important. Then I'll get you back to the bridge." "Leave me alone," I said loudly, quite frightened of him. He took no notice of my protests, but walked me along the path beside the channel. He was looking over my head across the channel, and I could not help noticing that whenever we passed a tree or a bush which cut off the view, he would pause and look past it before going on. This continued until we were near the time bridges again, when he came to a halt beside a huge, sprawling rhododendron bush. "Now," he said, "I want you to look, but don't let yourself be seen." Crouching down with him, I peered around the edge of the bush. At first I could not imagine what it was I was supposed to be looking at, and thought it was more houses for my inspection. The estate did, in fact, continue all along the further edge of the park, just visible beyond the trees. "Do you see her?" He pointed, then ducked back. Following the direction, I saw a young woman sitting on a bench on the far side of the channel. "Who is she?" I said, although her small figure did not actually arouse much curiosity in me. "The loveliest girl I have ever seen. She's always there, on that bench. She's waiting for her lover. She sits there every day, her heart filled with anguish and hope." As he said this, the young man's voice broke, as if with emotion, and I glanced up at him. His eyes were moist. I peered again around the edge of the bush and looked at the girl, wondering what it was about her that produced this reaction. I could hardly see her because she was huddled against the wind and had a shawl drawn over her hair. She was sitting to one side, facing towards the Tomorrow Bridge. To me, she was approximately as interesting as the houses, which is not to say very much, but she seemed important to the young man. "Is she a friend of yours?" I said, turning back to him. "No, not a friend, Michael, a symbol, a token of the love that is in us all." "What is her name?" I said, not following this interpretation. "Estelle, the most beautiful name in the world." Estelle. I had never heard the name before, and I repeated it softly. "How do you know this?" I said. "You say you—" "Wait, Michael. She will turn in a moment. You will see her face." His hand was clasping my shoulder, as if we were old friends, and although I was still shy of him, it assured me of his good intent. He was sharing something with me, something so important that I was honored to be included. Together, we leaned forward again and looked clandestinely at her. By my ear, I heard my friend say her name, so softly that it was almost a whisper. A few moments passed, then, as if the time vortex above the channel had swept the words slowly across to her, she raised her head, shrugged back the shawl, and stood up. I was craning my neck to see her, but she turned away. I watched her walk up the slope of the park grounds towards the houses beyond the trees. "Isn't she a beauty, Michael?" I was too young to understand him fully, so I said nothing. At that age, my only awareness of the other sex was that my sisters were temperamentally and physically different from me. I had yet to discover more interesting matters. In any event, I had barely caught a glimpse of Estelle's face. The young man was evidently enraptured by the girl, and as we watched her move through the distant trees, my attention was half on her, half on him. "I should like to be the man she loves," he said at last. "Do you love her, sir?" "Love? What I feel is too noble to be contained in such a word." He looked down at me, and for an instant I was reminded of the haughty disdain that my father sometimes revealed when I did something stupid. "Love is for lovers, Michael. I am a romantic, which is a far grander thing to be." I was beginning to find my companion rather pompous and overbearing, trying to involve me in his passions. I was an argumentative child, though, and could not resist pointing out a contradiction. "But you said she was waiting for her lover," I said. "Just a supposition. I think you are her lover and won't admit it." I used the word disparagingly, but it made him look at me thoughtfully. The drizzle was coming down again, a dank veil across the countryside. The young man stepped away suddenly. I think he had grown as tired of my company as I had of his. "I was going to show you how to get back," he said. "Come with me." He set off towards the bridge, and I went after him. "You'll have to go back the way you came. You jumped, didn't you?" "That's right," I said, puffing a little. It was difficult keeping up with him. As we reached the end of the bridge, the young man left the path and walked across the grass to the edge of the channel. I held back, nervous of going too close again. "Ah!" said the young man, peering down at the damp soil. "Look, Michael, these must be your footprints. This was where you landed." I went forward warily and stood just behind him. "Put your feet in these marks and jump towards the bridge." Although the metal edge of the bridge was only an arm's length away from where we were standing, it seemed a formidable jump, especially as the bridge was higher than the bank. I pointed this out. "I'll be behind you," the young man said. "You won't slip. Now, look on the bridge. There's a scratch on the floor. Do you see it? You have to aim at that. Try to land with one foot on either side, and you'll be back where you started." It all seemed rather unlikely. The part of the bridge he was pointing out was wet with rain and looked slippery. If I landed badly, I would fall. Worse, I could slip backwards into the flux fluid. Although I sensed that my new friend was right, that I could only get back by the way I had come, it did not feel right. "Michael, I know what you're thinking, but I made that mark. I've done it myself. Trust me." I was thinking of my father and his wrath. So at last I stepped forward and put my feet in the squelching impressions I had made as I landed. Rainwater was oozing down the muddy bank towards the flux fluid, but I noticed that as it dripped down to touch the fluid, it suddenly leaped back, just like the droplets of whiskey on the side of the glass my father drank in the evenings. The young man took a grip on my belt, holding on so that I should not slip down into the channel. "I'll count to 3, then you jump. I'll give you a shove. Are you ready?" "I think so." "You'll remember Estelle, won't you?" I looked over my shoulder. His face was very close to mine. "Yes, I'll remember her," I said, not meaning it. "Right. Brace yourself. It's quite a hop from here. 1..." I saw the fluid of the channel below me and to the side. It was glistening eerily in the gray light. 2, 3... I jumped forward at the same instant as the young man gave me a hefty shove from behind. Instantly I felt the electric crackle of the flux field. I heard again the loud roaring in my ears, and there was a split second of impenetrable blackness. My feet touched the edge of the time bridge, and I tripped, sprawling forward on the floor. I slithered awkwardly against the legs of a man standing just there, and my face fetched up against a pair of shoes, polished to a brilliant shine. I looked up. There was my father, staring down at me in great surprise. All I can now remember of that frightful moment is his face glaring down at me, topped by his black, curly-brimmed, stovepipe hat. He seemed to be as tall as a mountain. 5. My father was not a man who saw the merit of short, sharp punishment, and I lived under the cloud of my misdeed for several weeks. I felt that I had done what I had done in all innocence, and that the price I had to pay for it was too high. In our house, however, there was only one kind of justice, and that was father's. Although I had been in the future for only about an hour of my subjective time, 5 or 6 hours had passed for my family, and it was twilight when I returned. This prolonged absence was the main reason for my father's anger, although if I had jumped 32 years, as my companion had informed me, an error of a few hours on the return journey was as nothing. I was never called upon to explain myself. My father detested excuses. Saline and Therese were the only ones who asked what had happened, and I gave them a shortened account. I said that after I had jumped into the future and realized what I had done, I explored the park on my own and then jumped back. This was enough for them. I said nothing of the youth with the lofty sentiments, nor of the young lady who sat on the bench. Saline and Therese were thrilled enough that I had catapulted myself into the distant future, although my safe return did make the end of the story rather dull. Internally, I had mixed feelings about my adventure. I spent a lot of time on my own. Part of my punishment was that I could only go into the playroom one evening a week, and had to study more diligently instead, and tried to work out the meaning of what I had seen. The girl, Estelle, meant very little to me. She certainly had a place in my memory of that hour in the future, but because she was so fascinating to my companion, I remembered her through him, and she became of secondary interest. I thought about the young man a great deal. He had gone to such pains to make a friend of me and to include me in his private thoughts, and yet I remembered him as an intrusive and unwelcome presence. I often thought of his husky voice intoning those grand opinions, and even from the disadvantage of my junior years, his callow figure, all gangly limbs, slicked back hair, and downy mustache, was a comical one. For a long time I wondered who he could be. Although the answer seems obvious in retrospect, it was some years before I realized it, and whenever I was out in the town I would keep my eyes open in case we happened to meet. My penance came to an end about 3 months after the picnic. This parole was never formally stated, but understood by all concerned. The occasion was a party our parents allowed us to have for some visiting cousins, and after that my misbehavior was never again directly mentioned. The following summer, when the time came around for another picnic in Flux Channel Park, my father interrupted our excited outpourings to deliver a short speech, reminding us that we must all stay together. This was said to us all, although Father gave me a sharp and meaningful look. It was a small, passing cloud, and it threw no shadow on the day. I was obedient and sensible throughout the picnic, but as we walked through the park in the gentle heat of the day, I did not forget to look out for my helpful friend, nor for his adored Estelle. I looked and kept looking, but neither of them was there that day. 6. When I was 11, I was sent to school for the first time. I had spent my formative years in a household where wealth and influence were taken for granted, and where the governor had taken a lenient view of my education. Thrown suddenly into the company of boys from all walks of life, I retreated behind a manner of arrogance and condescension. It took 2 years to be scorned and beaten out of this, but well before then I had developed a wholehearted loathing for education and all that went with it. I became, in short, a student who did not study, and a pupil whose dislike for his fellows was heartily reciprocated. I became an accomplished malingerer, and with the occasional connivance of one of the servants I could readily feign a convincing, though unaccountable, stomach ailment, or develop infectious-looking rashes. Sometimes I would simply stay at home. More frequently, I would set off into the countryside on my bicycle and spend the day in pleasant musings. On days like this, I pursued my own form of education by reading, although this was by choice and not by compulsion. I eagerly read whatever novels and poetry I could lay my hands on. My preference in fiction was for adventure, and in poetry I soon discovered the romantics of the early 19th century, and the then much despised desolationists of 200 years later. The stirring combinations of valor and unrequited love, of moral virtue and nostalgic wistfulness, struck deep into my soul and made more pointed my dislike of the routines of school. It was at this time, when my reading was arousing passions that my humdrum existence could not satisfy, that my thoughts turned to the girl called Estelle. I needed an object for the stirrings within me. I envied the romantic poets their soulful yearnings, for they, it seemed to me, had at least had the emotional experience with which to focus their desires. The despairing desolationists, lamenting the waste around them, at least had known life. Perhaps I did not rationalize this need quite so neatly at the time, but whenever I was aroused by my reading, it was the image of Estill that came most readily to mind. Remembering what my companion had told me, and with my own sight of that small, huddled figure, I saw her as a lonely, heartbroken waif squandering her life in a hopeless vigil. That she was unspeakably beautiful and utterly faithful went without saying. As I grew older, my restlessness advanced. I felt increasingly isolated, not only from the other boys at school, but also from my family. My father's work was making more demands on him than ever before, and he was unapproachable. My sisters were going their own separate ways. Therese had developed an interest in ponies, Céline in young men. Nobody had time for me. No one tried to understand. One autumn, some 3 or 4 years after I started school, I surrendered at last to the stirrings of soul and flesh and attempted to allay them. 7. I selected the day with care, one when there were several lessons at school where my absence would not be too obvious. I left home at the usual time in the morning, but instead of heading for school, I rode to the city, bought a return ticket to the park at the railway station, and settled down on the train. During the summer, there had been the usual family outing to the park, but it had meant little to me. I had outgrown the immediate future. Tomorrow no longer concerned me. I was vested with purpose. When I arrived at the park on that stolen day, I went directly to the Tomorrow Bridge, paid the toll, and set off through the covered way towards the other side. There were more people about than I had expected, but it was quiet enough for what I wanted to do. I waited until I was the only one on the bridge, then went to the end of the covered way and stood by the spot from which I had first jumped. I took a flint from my pocket and scratched a thin but deep line in the metal surface of the bridge. I slipped the flint back in my pocket, then looked appraisingly at the bank below. I had no way of knowing how far to jump, only an instinct and a vague memory of how I had done it before. The temptation was to jump as far as possible, but I managed to suppress it. I placed my feet astride the line, took a deep breath, and launched myself towards the bank. A dizzying surge of electric tingling, momentary darkness, and I sprawled across the bank. Before I took stock of my surroundings, I marked the place where I had landed. First, I scraped a deep line in the soil and grass with the flint, pointing back towards the mark on the bridge, which was still visible, though less bright. Then I tore away several tufts of grass around my feet to make a second mark. Thirdly, I stared intently at the precise place, fixing it in memory so there would be no possibility of not finding it again. When satisfied, I stood up and looked around at this future. 8. It was a holiday. The park was crowded with people, all gay in summer clothes. The sun shone down from a cloudless sky. A breeze rippled the ladies' dresses, and from a distant pagoda a band played stirring marches. It was all so familiar that my first instinct was that my parents and sisters must be somewhere about, and my illicit visit would be discovered. I ducked down against the bank of the channel, but then I laughed at myself and relaxed. In my painstaking anticipation of this exploit, I had considered the possibility of meeting people I knew, and had decided that the chance was too slender to be taken seriously. Anyway, when I looked again at the people passing, who were paying me no attention, I realized that there were subtle differences in their clothes and hairstyles, reminding me that for all the superficial similarities I had indeed traveled to the future. I scrambled up to the tree-lined pathway and mingled with the throng, quickly catching the spirit of the day. I must have looked like any other schoolboy, but I felt very special indeed. After all, I had now leaped into the future twice. This euphoria aside, I was there with a purpose, and I did not forget it. I looked across to the other bank, searching for a sight of Estelle. She was not by the bench, and I felt a crushing and illogical disappointment, as if she had deliberately betrayed me by not being there. All the frustration of the past months welled up in me, and I could have shouted with the agony of it. But then, miraculously it seemed, I saw her, some distance away from the bench, wandering to and fro on the path on her side, glancing occasionally towards the Tomorrow Bridge. I recognized her at once, although I am not sure how. During that other day in the future I had barely seen her, and since then my imagination had run with a free rein, yet the moment I saw her I knew it was she. Gone was the shawl, and the arms that had been wrapped for warmth about her body were now folded casually across her chest. She was wearing a light summer frock, colored in a number of pastel shades, and to my eager eyes it seemed that no lovelier clothes could have been worn by any woman in the world. Her short hair fell prettily about her face, and the way she held her head and the way she stood seemed delicate beyond words. I watched her for several minutes, transfixed by the sight of her. People continued to mill past me, but for all I was aware of them, they might not have been there. At last I remembered my purpose, even though just seeing her was an experience whose joys I could not have anticipated. I walked back down the path, past the Tomorrow Bridge, and beyond to the Today Bridge. I hastened across and let myself through the exit turnstile on the other side. Still in the same day, I went up the path towards where I had seen Estelle. There were fewer people on this side of the channel, of course, and the path was less crowded. I looked around as I walked, noticing that custom had not changed, and that many people were sitting in the shade of the trees, with the remains of picnic meals spread out around them. I did not look too closely at these groups. It was still at the back of my mind that I might see my own family here. I passed the line of people waiting at the Tomorrow toll booth, and saw the path continuing beyond. A short distance away, walking slowly to and fro, was Estelle. At the sight of her, now so near to me, I paused. I walked on, less confidently than before. She glanced in my direction once, but she looked at me in the same disinterested way as she looked at everybody. I was only a few yards from her, and my heart was pounding and I was trembling. I realized that the little speech I had prepared, the one in which I introduced myself, then revealed myself as witty and mature, then proposed that she take a walk with me, had gone from my mind. She looked so grown up, so sure of herself. Unaware of my concentrated attention on her, she turned away when I was within touching distance of her. I walked on a few more paces, desperately unsure of myself. I turned and faced her. For the first time in my life, I felt the pangs of uncontrollable love. Until then, the word had had no meaning for me, but as I stood before her, I felt for her a love so shocking that I could only flinch away from it. How I must have appeared to her, I cannot say. I must have been shaking. I must have been bright with embarrassment. She looked at me with calm gray eyes and an inquiring expression, as if she detected that I had something of immense importance to say. She was so beautiful. I felt so clumsy. Then she smiled, unexpectedly, and I had my cue to say something. Instead, I stared at her, not even thinking of what I could say, but simply immobilized by the unexpected struggle with my emotions. I had thought love was so simple. Moments passed, and I could cope with the turbulence no more. I took a step back, and then another. Estill had continued to smile at me during those long seconds of my wordless stare, and as I moved away, her smile broadened and she parted her lips as if to say something. It was too much for me. I turned away, burning with embarrassment, and started to run. After a few steps, I halted and looked back at her. She was still looking at me, still smiling. I shouted, "I love you." It seemed to me that everyone in the park had heard me. I did not wait to see Estill's reaction. I ran away. I hurried along the path, then ran up a grassy bank and into the shelter of some trees. I ran and ran, crossing the concourse of the open-air restaurant, crossing a broad lawn, diving into the cover of more trees beyond. It was as if the physical effort of running would stop me thinking, because the moment I rested, the enormity of what I had done flooded in on me. It seemed that I had done nothing right and everything wrong. I had had a chance to meet her, and I had let it slip through my fingers. Worst of all, I had shouted my love at her, revealing it to the world. To my adolescent mind, it seemed there could have been no grosser mistake. I stood under the trees, leaning my forehead against the trunk of an old oak, banging my fist in frustration and fury. I was terrified that Estill would find me, and I never wanted to see her again. At the same time, I wanted her and loved her with a renewed passion, and hoped, but hoped secretly, that she would be searching for me in the park and would come to me by my tree and put her arms around me. A long time passed, and gradually my turbulent and contradictory emotions subsided. I still did not want to see Estill, so when I walked down to the path, I looked carefully ahead to be sure I would not meet her. When I stepped down to the path itself, where people still walked in casual enjoyment, oblivious of the drama, I looked along it towards the bridges, but saw no sign of her. I could not be sure she had left, so I hung around, torn between wincing shyness of her and profound devotion. At last I decided to risk it, and hurried along the path to the toll booths. I did not look for her, and I did not see her. I paid the toll at the Today Bridge and returned to the other side. I located the marks I had made on the bank beside the Tomorrow Bridge, aimed myself at the scratch on the bridge floor, and leaped across towards it. I emerged in the day I had left. Once again, my rough-and-ready way of traveling through time did not return me to a moment precisely true to elapsed time, but it was close enough. When I checked my watch against the clock in the toll booth, I discovered I had been gone for less than a quarter of an hour. Meanwhile, I had been in the future for more than 3 hours. I caught an earlier train home and idled away the rest of the day on my bicycle in the countryside, reflecting on the passions of man, the glories of young womanhood, and the accursed weaknesses of the will. 9. I should have learned from experience, and never tried to see Estill again, but there was no quieting the love I felt for her. Thoughts of her dominated every waking moment. It was the memory of her smile that was central. She had been encouraging me, inviting me to say the very things I had wanted to say, and I missed the chance. So, with the obsession renewed and intensified, I returned to the park, and did so many times. Whenever I could safely absent myself from school and could lay my hands on the necessary cash, I went to the Tomorrow Bridge and leaped across to the future. I was soon able to judge that dangerous leap with a marvelous instinctive skill. Naturally, there were mistakes. Once, terrifyingly, I landed in the night, and after that experience, I always took a small pocket flashlight with me. On 2 or 3 occasions, my return jump was inaccurate, and I had to use the time bridges to find the day I should have been in. After a few more of my leaps into the future, I felt sufficiently at home to approach a stranger in the park and ask him the date. By telling me the year, he confirmed that I was exactly 27 years into the future. Or, as it had been when I was 10, 32 years ahead. The stranger I spoke to was apparently a local man, and by his appearance a man of some substance, and I took him sufficiently into my confidence to point out Estelle to him. I asked him if he knew her, which he said he did, but could only confirm her given name. It was enough for me, because by then it suited my purpose not to know too much about her. I made no more attempts to speak to Estelle. Barred from approaching her by my painful shyness, I fell back on fantasies, which were much more in keeping with my timid soul. As I grew older and became more influenced by my favorite poets, it seemed not only more sad and splendid to glorify her from a distance, but appropriate that my role in her life should be passive. To compensate for my nervousness about trying to meet her again, I constructed a fiction about her. She was passionately in love with a disreputable young man who had tempted her with elaborate promises and wicked lies. At the very moment she had declared her love for him, he had deserted her by crossing the Tomorrow Bridge into a future from which he had never returned. In spite of his shameful behavior, her love held true, and every day she waited in vain by the Tomorrow Bridge, knowing that one day he would return. I would watch her covertly from the other side of the channel, knowing that her patience was that of the lovelorn, too proud for tears, too faithful for doubt. She was at ease with the knowledge that her long wait would be its own reward. In the present, in my real life, I sometimes dallied with another fiction, that I was her lover, that it was for me she was waiting. This thought excited me, arousing responses of a physical kind that I did not fully understand. I went to the park repeatedly, gladly suffering the punishments at school for my frequent and badly excused truancies. So often did I leap across to that future that I soon grew accustomed to seeing other versions of myself and realized that I had sometimes seen other young men before who looked suspiciously like me and who skulked near the trees and bushes beside the channel and gazed across as wistfully as I. There was one day in particular, a lovely sunny day at the height of the holiday season, that I often lighted on, and here there were more than a dozen versions of myself dispersed among the crowd. One day, not long before my 16th birthday, I took one of my now customary leaps into the future and found a cold and windy day, almost deserted. As I walked along the path, I saw a child, a small boy, plodding along with his head down against the wind and scuffing at the turf with the toes of his shoes. The sight of him, with his muddy legs and tear-streaked face, reminded me of that very first time I had jumped accidentally to the future, and I stared at him as we approached each other. He looked back at me, and for an instant a shock of recognition went through me like a bolt of electricity. He turned his eyes aside at once and stumped on by, heading towards the bridges behind me. I stared at him, recalling in vivid detail how I had felt that day, and how I had been fomenting a desperate plan to return to the day I had left, and as I did so I realized, at long last, the identity of the friend I had made that day. My head whirling with the recognition, I called after him, hardly believing what was happening. "Michael!" I said, the sound of my own name tasting strange in my mouth. The boy turned to look at me, and I said a little uncertainly, "It is Michael, isn't it? How do you know my name?" His stance was truculent, and he seemed unwilling to be spoken to. "I was looking for you," I said, inventing a reason for why I should have recognized him. "You've jumped forward in time and don't know how to get back." "Yes, but I'll show you how. It's easy." As we were speaking, a distracting thought came to me. So far, I had quite accidentally duplicated the conversation of that day. But what if I were to change it consciously? Suppose I said something that my friend had not. Suppose young Michael were not to respond in the way I had. The consequences seemed enormous, and I could imagine this boy's life, my own life, going in a direction entirely different. I saw the dangers of that, and I knew I had to make an effort to repeat the dialogue and my actions precisely. But just as it had when I tried to speak to Estill, my mind went blank. "It's all right, thank you, sir," the boy was saying. "I can find my own way." By running across the bridges? I wasn't sure if that was what had been said to me before, but I knew that had been my intention. "How did you know?" I found I could not depend on that distant memory, and so, trusting to the inevitable sweep of destiny, I stopped trying to remember. I said whatever came to mind. It was appalling to see myself through my own eyes. I had not imagined that I had been quite such a pathetic-looking child. I had every appearance of being a sullen and difficult boy. There was a stubbornness and a belligerence that I both recognized and disliked. And I knew there was a deeper weakness, too. I could remember how I had seen myself, my older self, that is. I recalled my friend from this day as callow and immature, and mannered with a loftiness that did not suit his years. That I, as child, had seen myself, as young man, in this light was condemnation of my then lack of percipience. I had learned a lot about myself since going to school, and I was more adult in my outlook than the other boys at school. What is more, since falling in love with Estill, I had taken great care over my appearance and clothes, and whenever I made one of these trips to the future, I looked my best. However, in spite of the shortcomings I saw in myself as boy, I felt sorry for young Michael, and there was certainly a feeling of great spirit between us. I showed him what I had noticed of the changes in the park, and then we walked together towards the Tomorrow Bridge. Estill was there on the other side of the channel, and I told him what I knew of her. I could not convey what was in my heart, but knowing how important she was to become to him, I wanted him to see her and love her. After she had left, I showed him the mark I had made in the surface of the bridge, and after I had persuaded him to make the leap, with several sympathetic thoughts about his imminent reception, I wandered alone in the blustery evening, wondering if Estill would return. There was no sign of her. I waited almost until nightfall, resolving that the years of admiring her from afar had been long enough. Something that young Michael had said deeply affected me. Allowing him a glimpse of my fiction, I had told him, "She is waiting for her lover." My younger self had replied, "I think you are her lover and won't admit it." I had forgotten saying that. I would not admit it, for it was not strictly true, but I would admit to the wish that it were so. Staring across the darkening channel, I wondered if there were a way of making it come true. The park was an eerie place in that light, and the temporal stresses of the flux field seemed to take on a tangible presence. Who knew what tricks could be played by time? I had already met myself once, twice, and seen myself many times over. And who was to say that Estill's lover could not be me? In my younger self, I had seen something about my older self that I could not see on my own. Michael had said it, and I wanted it to be true. I would make myself Estill's lover, and I would do it on my next visit to the park. 10. There were larger forces at work than those of romantic destiny, because soon after I made this resolution, my life was shaken out of its pleasant intrigues by the sudden death of my father. I was shocked by this more profoundly than I could ever have imagined. In the last 2 or 3 years I had seen very little of him, and thought about him even less. And yet, from the moment the maid ran into the drawing-room, shrilling that my father had collapsed across the desk in his study, I was stricken with the most awful guilt. It was I who had caused the death. I had been obsessed with myself, with Estill. If only I had thought more of him, he would not be dead. Of course, much of this was hysteria, but in the sad days before the funeral, it seemed less than wholly illogical. My father knew as much about the workings of the flux field as any man alive, and after my childhood adventure, he must have had some inkling that I had not left matters there. The school must have advised him of my frequent absences, and yet he said nothing. It was almost as if he had been deliberately standing by, hoping something might come of it all. In the days following his death, a period of emotional transition, it seemed to me that Estill was inextricably bound up with the tragedy. However much it flew in the face of reason, I could not help feeling that if I had spoken to Estill, if I had acted rather than hidden, then my father would still be alive. I did not have long to dwell on this. When the first shock and grief had barely passed, it became clear that nothing would ever be quite the same again for me. My father had made a will in which he bequeathed me the responsibility for his family, his work, and his fortune. I was still legally a child, and one of my uncles took over the administration of the affairs until I reached my majority. This uncle, deeply resentful that none of the fortune had passed to him, made the most of his temporary control over our lives. I was removed from school and started in my father's work. The family house was sold, the governor and the other servants were discharged, and my mother was moved to a smaller household in the country. Saline was quickly married off, and Therese was sent to boarding school. It was made plain that I should take a wife as soon as possible. My love for Estill, my deepest secret, was thrust away from me by forces I could not resist. Until the day my father died, I did not have much conception of what his work involved, except to know that he was one of the most powerful and influential men in the European Union. This was because he controlled the power stations which tapped energy from the temporal stresses of the flux field. On the day I inherited his position, I assumed this meant he was fabulously wealthy, but I was soon relieved of this misapprehension. The power stations were state-controlled, and the so-called fortune comprised a large number of debentures in the enterprise. In real terms, these could not be cashed, thus explaining many of the extreme decisions taken by my uncle. Death duties were considerable, and in fact, I was in debt because of them for many years afterwards. The work was entirely foreign to me, and I was psychologically and academically unready for it, but because the family was now my responsibility, I applied myself as best I could. For a long time, shaken and confused by the abrupt change in our fortunes, I could do nothing but cope. My adolescent adventures in Flux Channel Park became memories as elusive as dreams. It was as if I had become another person. But I had lived with the image of Estill for so long that nothing could make me forget her. The flame of romanticism that had lighted my youth faded away, but it was never entirely extinguished. In time, I lost my obsessive love for Estill, but I could never forget her wan beauty, her tireless waiting. By the time I was 22, I was in command of myself. I had mastered my father's job. Although the position was hereditary, as most employment was hereditary, I discharged my duties well and conscientiously. The electricity generated by the flux field provided roughly 9/10 of all the energy consumed in the European Union, and much of my time was spent in dealing with the multitude of political demands for energy. I traveled widely to every state in federal Europe and further abroad. Of the family, my mother was settling into her long years of widowhood, and the social esteem that naturally followed. Both my sisters were married. Of course, I too married in the end, succumbing to the social pressures that every man of standing has to endure. When I was 21, I was introduced to Doreen, a cousin of Saline's husband, and within a few months we were wed. Doreen, an intelligent and attractive young woman, proved to be a good wife, and I loved her. When I was 25, she bore our first child, a girl. I needed an heir, for that was the custom of my country, but we rejoiced at her birth. We named her Therese, after my sister, but Doreen had wanted to call her Estill, a girl's name then very popular, and I had to argue against her. I never explained why. 2 years later, my son Carl was born, and my position in society was secure. 11. The years passed, and the glow of adolescent longing for Estill dimmed still further, because I was happy with my growing family and fulfilled by the demands of my work. Those strange experiences in Flux Channel Park seemed to be a minor aberration from a life that was solid, conventional, and unadventurous. I was no longer romantic in outlook. I saw those noble sentiments as the product of immaturity and inexperience, and such was the change in me that Doreen sometimes complained I was unimaginative. But if the romance of Estill faded with time, a certain residual curiosity about her did not. I wanted to know. What had become of her? Who was she? Was she as beautiful as I remembered her? Setting out these questions has lent them an urgency they did not possess. They were the questions of idle moments, or when something happened to remind me of her. Sometimes, for instance, my work took me along the Flux Channel, and then I would think briefly of her. For a short time, a young woman worked in my office, and she had the same name. As I grew older, a year or more would sometimes pass without a thought of Estill. I should probably have gone for the rest of my life with these questions unanswered if it had not been for an event of major world importance. When the news of it came out, it seemed for a time to be the most exciting event of the century, as in some ways it was. The starship that had been launched 100 years before was returning. This news affected every aspect of my work, and at once I was involved in strategic and political planning at the highest level. What it meant was this: the starship could only return to Earth by the same means as it had left. The Flux Channel would have to be reconverted, if only temporarily, to its proper use. The houses in its vicinity would have to be evacuated, the power tapping stations would have to be disconnected, and the park and its time bridges would have to be destroyed. For me, the disconnection of the power stations, with the inevitable result of depriving the European Union of most of its electricity, created immense problems. Permission had to be sought from other countries to generate electricity from fossil deposits for the months the flux stations were inoperable, and permission of that sort could only be obtained after intricate political negotiation and bargaining. We had less than a year in which to achieve this. But the coming destruction of the park struck a deeper note in me, as it did in many people. The park was a much-loved playground, familiar to everyone, and for many people, ineradicably linked with memories of childhood. For me, it was strongly associated with the idealism of my youth and with a girl I had loved for a time. If the park and its bridges were closed, I knew that my questions about Estill would never be answered. I had leaped into a future where the park was still a playground, where the houses beyond the trees were still occupied. Through all my life, I had thought of that future as an imaginary or ideal world, one unattainable except by a dangerous leap from a bridge. But that future was no longer imaginary. I was now 42 years old. It was 32 years since I, as a 10-year-old boy, had leaped 32 years into the future. Today and tomorrow coexisted once more in Flux Channel Park. If I did not act in the next few weeks before the park was closed, I should never see Estill again. The memory of her flared into flame again, and I felt a deep sense of frustration. I was much too busy to go in search of a boyhood dream. I delegated. I relieved 2 subordinates from work in which they would have been better employed, and told them what I wanted to discover. They were to locate a young woman or girl who lived, possibly alone, possibly not, in one of the houses that bordered the park. The estate consisted of some 200 houses. In time, my subordinates gave me a list of over 150 possible names, and I scanned it anxiously. There were 27 women living in the estate who were called Estill. It was a popular name. I returned 1 employee to his proper work, but retained the other, a woman named Robin. I took her partially into my confidence. I said that the girl was a distant relative and that I was anxious to locate her, but for family reasons I had to be discreet. I believed she was frequently to be found in the park. Within a few days, Robin confirmed that there was one such girl. She and her mother lived together in one of the houses. The mother was confined to the house by the conventions of mourning. Her husband had died within the last 2 years, and the daughter, Estill, spent almost every day alone in the park. Robin said she had been unable to discover why she went there. The date had been fixed when Flux Channel Park would be closed to the public, and it was some 8.5 months ahead. I knew that I would soon be signing the order that would authorize the closure. One day between now and then, if for no other reason, Estill's patient waiting would have to end. I took Robin further into my confidence. I instructed her to go to the park and, by repeated use of the Tomorrow Bridge, go into the future. All she was to report back to me was the date on which Estill's vigil ended. Whether Robin wondered at the glimpses of my obsession she was seeing, I cannot say, but she went without demur and did my work for me. When she returned, she had the date. It was just over 6 weeks away. That interview with Robin was fraught with undertones that neither side understood. I did not want to know too much, because with the return of my interest in Estill had come something of that sense of romantic mystery. Robin, for her part, clearly had seen something that intrigued her. I found it all most unsettling. I rewarded Robin with a handsome cash bonus and returned her to her duties. I marked the date in my private diary, then gave my full attention to the demands of my proper work. 12. As the date approached, I knew I could not be at the park. On that day, there was to be an energy conference in Geneva, and there was no possibility of my missing it. I made a futile attempt to change the date, but who was I against 50 heads of state? Once more I was tempted to let the great preoccupation of my youth stay forever unresolved, but again I succumbed to it. I could not miss this one last chance. I made my travel arrangements to Geneva with care and instructed my secretarial staff to reserve me a compartment on the one overnight train which would get me there in time. It meant that I should have to visit the park on the day before the vigil was to end, but by using the Tomorrow Bridge I could still be there to see it. At last, the day came. I had no one to answer to but myself, and shortly after midday I left my office and had my driver take me to the park. I left him and the carriage in the yard beyond the gate, and with one glance towards the estate of houses, where I knew Estill and her mother lived, I went into the park. I had not been in the park itself since my last visit, just before my father died, and knowing that one's childhood haunts often seem greatly changed when revisited years later, I had been expecting to find the place smaller, less grand than I remembered it. But as I walked slowly down the gently sloping sward towards the toll booths, it seemed that the magnificent trees and the herbaceous borders, the fountains, the pathways, and all the various kinds of landscaping in the park gardens were just as I recalled them. But the smells! In my adolescent longing, I had not responded to those, the sweet bark, the sweeping leaves, the clustered flowers. A man with a mowing machine clattered past, throwing up a moist green smell, and the shorn grass humped in the mower's hood like a sleeping furry animal. I watched the man as he reached the edge of the lawn he was cutting, turned the machine, then bent low over it to start it up the incline for his return. I had never pushed a mower, and as if this last day in the park had restored my childhood, I felt an urge to dash across to him and ask him if I might try my hand. I smiled to myself as I walked on. I was a well-known public figure, and in my draped suit and tall silk hat, I should certainly have cut a comic sight. Then there were the sounds. I heard, as if for the first time, and yet also with a faint and distracting nostalgia, the metallic click of the turnstile ratchets, the sound of the breeze in the pines that surrounded the park, and the almost continuous soprano of children's voices. Somewhere a band was playing marches. I saw a family at picnic beneath one of the weeping willows. The servants stood to one side, and the paterfamilias was carving a huge joint of cold beef. I watched them surreptitiously for a moment. It might have been my own family, a generation before. People's delights did not change. So taken was I by all this that I had nearly reached the toll booths before I remembered Estill. Another private smile. My younger self would not have been able to understand this lapse. I was feeling more relaxed, welcoming the tranquil surroundings of the park and remembering the past, but I had grown out of the obsessive associations the place had once had for me. I had come to the park to see Estill, though, so I went on past the toll booths until I was on the path that ran beside the channel. I walked a short way, looking ahead. Soon I saw her, and she was sitting on the bench, staring towards the Tomorrow Bridge. It was as if a quarter of a century had been obliterated. All the calm and restful mood went from me as if it had never existed, to be replaced by a ferment of emotions that was the more shocking for being so unexpected. I came to a halt, turned away, thinking that if I looked at her any more she would surely notice me. The adolescent, the immature, the romantic child. I was still all of these, and the sight of Estill awakened them as if from a short nap. I felt large and clumsy and ridiculous in my over-formal clothes, as if I were a child wearing a grandparent's wedding outfit. Her composure, her youthful beauty, the vital force of her vigil, they were enough to renew all those inadequacies I had felt as a teenager. But at the same time there was a second image of her, one which lay above the other like an elusive ghost. I was seeing her as an adult sees a child. She was so much younger than I remembered her. She was smaller. She was pretty, yes, but I had seen prettier women. She was dignified, but it was a precocious poise, as if she had been trained in it by a socially conscious parent. And she was young, so very young. My own daughter, Therese, would be the same age now, perhaps slightly older. Thus, acutely conscious of my divided way of seeing her, I stood in confusion and distraction on the pathway, while the families and couples walked gaily past. I backed away from her at last, unable to look at her any more. She was wearing clothes I remembered too well from the past, a narrow white skirt tight around her legs, a shiny black belt, and a dark blue blouse embroidered with flowers across the bodice. I remembered so much, too much. I wished she had not been there. She frightened me because of the power she had, the power to awaken and arouse my emotions. I did not know what it was. Everyone has adolescent passions, but how many people have the chance to revisit those passions in maturity? It elated me, but also made me deeply melancholic. Inside, I was dancing with love and joy, but she terrified me. She was so innocently, glowingly young, and I was now so old. 13. I decided to leave the park at once, but changed my mind an instant later. I went towards her, then turned yet again and walked away. I was thinking of Dorine, but trying to put her out of my mind, I was thinking of Estelle, obsessed again. I walked until I was out of sight of her, then took off my hat and wiped my brow. It was a warm day, but I knew that the sweat was not caused by the weather. I needed to calm myself, wanted somewhere to sit down and think about it, but the park was for pleasure, and when I went towards the open-air restaurant to buy a glass of beer, the sight of all the heedless merriment was intrusive and unwelcome. I stood on the uncut grass, watching the man with the mower, trying to control myself. I had come to the park to satisfy an old curiosity, not to fall again into the traps of childhood infatuation. It was unthinkable that I should let a young girl of 16 distract me from my stable life. It had been a mistake, a stupid mistake, to return to the park. But inevitably there was a deeper sense of destiny beneath my attempts to be sensible. I knew, without being able to say why, that Estelle was waiting there at her bench for me, and that we were destined at last to meet. Her vigil was due to end tomorrow, and that was just a short distance away. It lay on the far side of the Tomorrow Bridge. 14. I tried to pay at the toll booth, but the attendant recognized me at once. He released the ratchet of the turnstile with such a sharp jab of his foot that I thought he might break his ankle. I nodded to him and passed through into the covered way. I walked across briskly, trying to think no more about what I was doing or why. The flux field prickled about my body. I emerged into bright sunlight. The day I had left had been warm and sunny, but here in the next day it was several degrees hotter. I felt stiff and overdressed in my formal clothes, not at all in keeping with the reawakened, desperate hope that was in my breast. Still trying to deny that hope, I retreated into my daytime demeanor, opening the front of my coat and thrusting my thumbs into the slit pockets of my waistcoat, as I sometimes did when addressing subordinates. I walked along the path beside the channel, looking across for a sight of Estelle on the other side. Someone tugged at my arm from behind, and I turned in surprise. There was a young man standing there. He was nearly as tall as me, but his jacket was too tight across his shoulders, and his trousers were a fraction too short, revealing that he was still growing up. He had an obsessive look to him, but when he spoke, it was obvious he was from a good family. "Sir, may I trouble you with a question?" he said, and at once I realized who he was. The shock of recognition was profound, and had I not been so preoccupied with Estelle, I'm sure meeting him would have made me speechless. It was so many years since my time jumping that I had forgotten the jolting sense of recognition and sympathy. I controlled myself with great difficulty. Trying not to reveal my knowledge of him, I said, "What do you wish to know?" "Would you tell me the date, sir?" I started to smile and glanced away from him for a moment to straighten my face. His earnest eyes, his protuberant ears, his pallid face and quiffed-up hair. "Do you mean today's date, or do you mean the year?" "Well, both, actually, sir." I gave him the answer at once, although as soon as I had spoken, I realized I had given him today's date, whereas I had stepped forward one day beyond that. No matter, though. What I, was interested in was the year. He thanked me politely and made to step away. Then he paused, looked at me with a guileless stare, which I remembered had been an attempt to take the measure of this forbidding-looking stranger in a frock coat, and said, "Sir, do you happen to live in these parts?" "I do," I said, knowing what was coming. I had raised a hand to cover my mouth and was stroking my upper lip. "I wonder if you would happen to know the identity of a certain person often to be seen in this park?" "Who?" I could not finish the sentence. His eager, pinkening earnestness was extremely comical, and I spluttered an explosive laugh. At once I turned it into a simulated sneeze, and while I made a play with my handkerchief, I muttered something about hay fever. Forcing myself to be serious, I returned my handkerchief to my pocket and straightened my hat. "Who do you mean?" "A young lady of about my own age." Unaware of my amusement, he moved past me and went down the bank to where there was a thick cluster of rose bushes. From behind their cover, he looked across at the other side. He made sure I was looking too, then pointed. I could not see Estill at first because of the crowds, but then saw that she was standing quite near to the queue for the Tomorrow Bridge. She was wearing her dress of pastel colors, the clothes she had been wearing when I first loved her. "Do you see her, sir?" His question was like a discordant note in a piece of music. I had become perfectly serious again, and just seeing her made me want to fall into reflective silence. The way she held her head, the innocent composure. He was waiting for a reply, so I said, Yes, a local girl. Do you know her name, sir?" "I believe she is called Estill." An expression of surprised pleasure came over his face, and his flush deepened. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." He backed away from me, but I said, "Wait." I had a sudden instinct to help him, to cut short those months of agony. "You must go and talk to her, you know. She wants to meet you. You mustn't be shy of her." He stared at me in horror, then turned and ran into the crowd. Within a few seconds I could see him no more. The enormity of what I had done struck me forcibly. Not only had I touched him on his most vulnerable place, forcing him to confront the one matter he had to work out for himself in his own time, but impetuously I had interfered with the smooth progression of events. In my memory of the meeting, the stranger in the silk hat had not given unsolicited advice. A few minutes later, as I walked slowly along the path, pondering on this, I saw my younger self again. He saw me, and I nodded to him as an introduction, perhaps, to telling him to ignore what I had said, but he glanced away disinterestedly, as if he had never seen me before. There was something odd about him. He had changed his clothes, and the new ones fitted better. I mused over this for a while, until I realized what must have happened. He was not the same Michael I had spoken to. He was still myself, but here on this day from another day in the past. A little later I saw myself again. This time he was wearing the same clothes as before. Was it the youth I had spoken to, or was it myself from yet another day? I was quite distracted by all this, but never so much that I forgot the object of it all. Estill was there on the other side of the channel, and while I paced along the pathway, I made certain she was never out of my sight. She had waited beside the toll booth queue for several minutes, but now she had walked back to the main path and was standing on the grassy bank, staring, as I had seen her do so many times before, towards the Tomorrow Bridge. I could see her much better there, her slight figure, her young beauty. I was feeling calmer at last. I no longer saw a double image of her. Meeting myself as a youth and seeing other versions of myself had reminded me that Estill and I, apparently divided by the flux field, were actually united by it. My presence here was inevitable. Today was the last day of her vigil, although she might not know it, and I was here because I was supposed to be here. She was waiting, and I was waiting. I could resolve it. I could resolve it now. She was looking directly across the channel and seemed to be staring deliberately at me, as if the inspiration had struck her in the same instant. Without thinking, I waved my arm at her. Excitement ran through me. I turned quickly and set off down the path towards the bridges. If I crossed the Today Bridge, I should be with her in a matter of a few seconds. It was what I had to do. When I reached the place where the Tomorrow Bridge opened onto this side, I looked back across the channel to make sure of where she was standing. But she was no longer waiting. She, too, was hurrying across the grass, rushing towards the bridges. As she ran, she was looking across the channel, looking at me. She reached the crowd of people waiting by the toll booth, and I saw her pushing past them. I lost sight of her as she went into the booth. I stood at my end of the bridge, looking down the ill-lit covered way. Daylight was a bright square 200 feet away. A small figure in a long dress hurried up the steps at the far end and ran into the wooden tunnel. Estill came towards me, raising the front of her skirt as she ran. I glimpsed trailing ribbons, white stockings. With each step, Estill moved further into the flux field. With each frantic, eager step towards me, her figure became less substantial. She was less than a third of the way across before she had blurred and dissolved into nothing. I saw her mistake. She was crossing the wrong bridge. When she reached this side, when she stood where I stood now, she would be 24 hours too late. I stared helplessly down the gloomy covered way, watching as two children slowly materialized before me. They pushed and squabbled, each trying to be the first to emerge into the new day. 15. I acted without further delay. I left the Tomorrow Bridge and ran back up the slope to the path. The Today Bridge was about 50 yards away, and clapping a hand on the top of my hat, I ran as fast as I could towards it. I thought only of the extreme urgency of catching Estill before I lost her. If she realized her mistake and began to search for me, we might be forever crossing and recrossing the channel on one bridge after another, forever in the same place, but forever separated in time. I scrambled on to the end of the Today Bridge and hurried across. I had to moderate my pace, as the bridge was narrow and several other people were crossing. This bridge, of the three, was the only one with windows to the outside, and as I passed each one I paused to look anxiously at each end of the Tomorrow Bridge, hoping for a glimpse of her. At the end of the bridge, I pushed quickly through the exit turnstile, leaving it rattling and clattering on its ratchet. I set off at once towards the Tomorrow Bridge, reaching for the money to pay the toll. In my haste, I bumped into someone. It was a woman, and I murmured an apology as I passed, affording her only a momentary glance. We recognized each other in the same instant. It was Robin, the woman I had sent to the park. But why was she here now? As I reached the toll booth, I looked back at her again. She was staring at me with an expression of intense curiosity, but as soon as she saw me looking, she turned away. Was this the conclusion of the vigil she had reported to me on? Is this what she had seen? I could not delay. I pushed rudely past the people at the head of the queue and threw some coins onto the worn brass plate where the tickets were ejected mechanically towards the buyer. The attendant looked up at me, recognized me as I recognized him. "Compliments of the park again, sir," he said, and slid the coins back to me. I had seen him only a few minutes before, yesterday in his life. I scooped up the coins and returned them to my pocket. The turnstile clicked as I pushed through. I went up the steps and entered the covered way. Far ahead, the glare of daylight of the day I was in, the bare interior of the covered way with lights at intervals, no people. I started to walk, and when I had gone a few paces across the flux field, the daylight squared in the far end of the tunnel became night. It felt much colder. And ahead of me, two small figures, solidifying, or so it seemed, out of the electrical haze of the field. They were standing together under one of the lights, partly blocking the way. I went nearer and saw that one of them was Estill. The figure with her had his head turned away from me. I paused. I had halted where no light fell on me, and although I was only a few feet away from them, I would have seemed, as they seemed to me, a ghostly, half-visible apparition, but they were occupied with each other and did not look towards me. I heard him say, "Do you live around here?" "In one of the houses, by the park. What about you?" "No, I have to come here by train." The hands held nervously by his side, the fingers curling and uncurling. "I've often seen you here," she said. "You stare a lot." I wondered who you were. There was a silence then, while the youth looked shyly at the floor, apparently thinking of more to say. Estill glanced beyond him to where I was standing, and for a moment we looked directly into each other's eyes. She said to the young man, "It's cold here. Shall we go back?" "We could go for a walk, or I could buy you a glass of orange." "I'd rather go for a walk." They turned and walked towards me. She glanced at me again with a frank stare of hostility. I had been listening in, and she well knew it. The young man was barely aware of my presence. As they passed me, he was looking first at her, then nervously at his hands. I saw his too tight clothes, his quiff of hair combed up, his pink ears and neck, his downy mustache. He walked clumsily, as if he were about to trip over his own feet, and he did not know where to put his hands. I loved him. I had loved her. I followed them a little way until light shone in again at the toll booth end. I saw him stand aside to let her through the turnstile first. Out in the sunshine she danced across the grass, letting the colors of her dress shine out, and then she reached over and took his hand. They walked away together across the newly cut lawns towards the trees. 16. I waited until Estill and I had gone, and then I too went out into the day. I crossed to the other side of the channel on the yesterday bridge and returned on the today bridge. It was the day I had arrived in the park, the day before I was due in Geneva, the day before Estill and I were finally to meet. Outside in the yard, my driver would be waiting with the carriage. Before I left, I went for one more walk along the path on this side of the channel and headed for the bench where I knew Estill would be waiting. I saw her through the crowd. She was sitting quietly and watching the people, dressed neatly in her white skirt and dark blue blouse. I looked across the channel. The sunshine was bright and hazy, and there was a light breeze. I saw the promenading holiday-makers on the other side, the bright clothes, the festive hats, the balloons, and the children, but not everyone blended with the crowd. There was a rhododendron bush beside the channel, and behind it I could just see the figure of a youth. He was staring across at Estill. Behind him, walking along deep in thought, was another Michael. Further along the bank, well away from the bridges, another Michael sat in long grass overlooking the channel. I waited, and before long, another Michael appeared. A few minutes later, yet another Michael appeared and took up position behind one of the trees over there. I did not doubt that there were many more, each oblivious of all the others, each preoccupied with the girl who sat on the bench a few feet from me. I wondered which one it was I had spoken to. None of them, perhaps, or all of them? I turned towards Estill at last and approached her. I went to stand directly in front of her and removed my hat. "Good afternoon, miss," I said. "Pardon me for speaking to you like this." She looked up at me in sharp surprise. I had interrupted her reverie. She shook her head, but turned on a polite smile for me. "Do you happen to know who I am?" I said. "Of course, sir. You're very famous." She bit her lower lip, as if wishing she had not answered so promptly. "What I meant was, yes," I said. "Do you trust my word?" She frowned then, and it was a consciously pretty gesture, a child borrowing a mannerism from an adult. "It will happen tomorrow," I said. "Sir?" "Tomorrow," I said again, trying to find some subtler way of putting it. "What you're waiting for. It will happen then." "How do you—" "Never mind that," I said. I stood erect, running my fingers across the brim of my hat. In spite of everything, she had the uncanny facility of making me nervous and awkward. "I'll be across there tomorrow," I said, pointing to the other side of the channel. "Look out for me. I'll be wearing these clothes, this hat. You'll see me wave to you. That's when it will be." She said nothing to this, but looked steadily at me. I was standing against the light, and she could not have been able to see me properly. But I could see her, with the sun on her face, and with light dancing in her hair and her eyes. She was so young, so pretty. It was like pain to be near her. "Wear your prettiest dress," I said. "Do you understand?" She still did not answer, but I saw her eyes flicker towards the far side of the channel. There was a pinkness in her cheeks, and I knew I had said too much. I wished I had not spoken to her at all. I made a courtly little bow and replaced my hat. "Good day to you, miss," I said. "Good day, sir." I nodded to her again, then walked past her and turned on to the lawn behind the bench. I went a short way up the slope and moved over to the side until I was hidden from Estill by the trunk of a huge tree. I could see that on the far side of the channel one of the Michaels I had spotted earlier had moved out from his hiding place. He stood on the bank in clear view. He had apparently been watching me as I spoke to Estill, for now I could see him looking across at me, shading his eyes with his hand. I was certain that it was him I had spoken to. I could help him no more. If he now crossed the channel twice, moving forward 2 days, he could be on the tomorrow bridge to meet Estill as she answered my signal. He stared across at me, and I stared back. Then I heard a whoop of joy. He started running. He hurried along the bank and went straight to the Today Bridge. I could almost hear the hollow clumping of his shoes as he ran through the narrow way, and moments later he emerged on this side. He walked, more sedately now, to the queue for the Tomorrow Bridge. As he stood in line, he was looking at Estill. She, staring thoughtfully at the ground, did not notice. Michael reached the toll booth. As he went to the pay desk, he looked back at me and waved. I took off my hat and waved it. He grinned happily. In a few seconds, he had disappeared into the covered way, and I knew I would not see him again. He had got it right. He would be there to meet her. I had seen it happen. I replaced my hat and walked away from the channel, up through the stately trees of the park, past where the gardener was still pushing his heavy mower against the grass, past where many families were sitting beneath the trees at their picnic luncheons. I saw a place beneath a wide old cedar where I and my parents and sisters had often eaten our meals. A cloth was spread out across the grass with several dishes set in readiness for the meal. An elderly couple was sitting here, well under the shade of the branches. The lady was sitting stiffly in a folding canvas chair, watching patiently as her husband prepared the meat. He was carving a ham joint, taking slices from beneath the notch with meticulous strokes. Two servants stood in the background with white linen cloths draped over their forearms. Like me, the gentleman was in formal wear. His frock coat was stiff and perfectly ironed, and his shoes shone as if they had been polished for weeks. On the ground beside him, his silken stovepipe hat had been laid on a scarf. He noticed my uninvited regard and looked up at me. For a moment, our gaze met, and we nodded to each other like the gentlemen we were. I touched the brim of my hat, wished him and the lady good afternoon. Then I hurried towards the yard outside. I wanted to see Dorine before I caught the train to Geneva.